Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. Well, has Vladimir Putin found a way to bring about the end of the Ukraine conflict? That is something we're going to delve into and take a look at. Paul, as always, I want to thank you for being a part of the discussion. And there's a number of different things going on with Ukraine, not just what's going on with Putin on his side.
Yeah, well, obviously, thank you likewise for joining me today. It's a pleasure as always. Well, yeah, the Ukraine's is interesting for reasons other than what most people think Ukraine's interesting for. And it's not what's going on the ground day to day because Ukraine's long since lost the war. There's even been admissions coming out of the West now that 2 years ago they knew Ukraine had lost the war when this much fabled counteroffensive by the Ukrainians was an abysmal failure. I would argue they never stood a chance of winning the war, full stop, but we're not here to discuss that aspect today. But this has been a reality for quite some time, so discussing it is rather pointless. I think one thing worth mentioning initially is discussions began between the Russians and the Americans. Lots of statements made there as though they've reached an agreement. They haven't. All they've agreed on is how they can allow freedom of passage of Russian grain and fertilizers through the Black Sea, which I think is a great initiative. Whether the Ukrainians agree to it, whether they can enforce that is an entirely different matter. But in essence, the Russians are playing a clever game. They're giving the Americans enough reason to say, well, they're cooperating. They said we won't bomb energy infrastructure. They've agreed to that. The next agreement, we've agreed to a Black Sea initiative, which, bear in mind, was agreed originally, and then the Ukrainians basically ignored it and carried on targeting whoever they wanted to target, obviously, excuse me, inside the Black Sea region. But what Russia's not doing is giving America everything they want all at the same time. It's a slow grinding process because they think other issues could happen inside Ukraine that could then affect a way of ending the war without Russia having to concede anything at all. But they're giving them positive reasons to want to continue dialogue. Ukraine's not giving the Americans anything, and that's part of the huge problem that both the Russians and the Ukrainians, the Americans, are facing. Now, obviously, in recent weeks, Zelensky's behavior is becoming more and more of a problem. And I think a good starting point with that will be developments associated with the mineral deal. But what I'll do, Ken, is just allow you give way to you, and then we'll come on to the mineral deal and what has been unfolding in the last week or so.
Yeah, I think one of the more important things, especially that lead up you gave, is in regards to how Putin is seeing this. He knows, obviously, he knows, and his administration knows Ukraine and the mindset of Ukraine extraordinarily well. And by doing, the agreeing to the portions of a ceasefire, whether it's not bombing infrastructure, energy, etc., allowing shipping, et cetera, Putin seems to know that it won't take very long before Zelensky in Ukraine simply just ignore it and do what they want. Because you have to ask the question: is Zelensky being pushed, from his own government, or is he being pushed from the Europeans? What came out today, there was a depot that was hit again, and Zakharova pretty much said, that was the French and British intelligence. So they're pushing him to not stand by any type of ceasefire agreement. And the more and more and more that Ukraine breaks, like we spoke with in a different podcast in Iran, the more that Ukraine fails in upholding the agreements that they sign on to, the more and more Russia can say, you know what, United States, we can't rely upon them, and we're just going to continue to do our objectives. We've been honest and upright and trustworthy. They can't be. So, pick a side. Who are you going to support? Because obviously you're not getting what you need from Ukraine.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of that problem relates to this mineral deal because the United States hasn't helped themselves, frankly, because Trump again claimed they'd reached an agreement. Of course, there was that whole Oval Office debacle with Vance, Zelensky, and Trump. And then basically Zelensky left, was told to go home, no agreement signed. But the agreement was supposed to be in place. Then subsequently, it was supposed to be in place again, and nothing had been agreed, it would seem, because again, nothing got signed. Then there was a kind of partial admission, well, there's some discussions need to be entered into, but we're very close to signing this deal. And then the news came out of what this revised deal was. And frankly, if Zelensky had signed it, he would be selling his people down the river in perpetuity, because it's an absolutely appalling deal, which would effectively gut what's left of the nation, which isn't an awful lot, by the way, because, Russia controls huge amounts of the assets that Ukraine has or had. Never mind what this proposed mineral deal would do. But basically, the agreement would be indefinite, which means unless, of course, the United States chose to end it, well, why would they? Well, they may do in 20, 30 years, or in 10 years if they get a sensible administration in. But effectively, they can make amendments to it. The Ukrainians can't. Not only would it include all this alleged mineral wealth that doesn't exist, of course, but it would also include oil and gas. Now, previously, there was an agreement that they wouldn't touch existing oil and gas reserves. Well, it now appears as though it's everything, including existing oil and gas reserves. And, of course, one of the biggest problems from Ukraine's perspective, there was no statement about security guarantees for Ukraine. Okay, the United States will argue, well, we have assets there, we're going to protect them. But in essence, that's not a security guarantee for Ukraine. Now, I'm not saying Ukraine will get it or should have it, but the United States is really making that point in a rather kind of very overt way. Now, upon Zelensky being in receipt of this, he's basically backtracked now and says, I'm not signing any of these deals, which I would agree with him in that context, because he is selling the country down the river forever. But that is going to deeply anger the United States in the process. Now, of course, one of the big issues as far as Trump's concerned is, well, we spend huge sums of money. Who knows what's actually being spent? Is it 150 billion? Is it 200 billion? I don't know. Huge sums of money anyway. And Zelensky is basically now also stating, well, as far as I'm concerned, or my administration is, or Ukraine's concerned, we are not going to regard any of the money we've received prior to this date as being a loan. So effectively, the United States, is not going to get a penny back, excuse me, of all the money you've already, given us, whether it's 200 billion, whatever. Well, frankly, the United States is going to be furious about that, as we know. So you're starting to see where the Russians have said for a long time, we can't negotiate with Zelensky. It's impossible. We had agreements and Zelensky walked away from it. Okay, whether that's under the influence of the Europeans, people within his own ranks, whoever's pulling the strings in Ukraine, it's irrelevant. What's relevant is Zelensky is the president. He walks away from things consistently. He's untrustworthy. You can't negotiate anything with him. And now, frankly, the United States is looking at this going, well, you know what? We've got the same problem, because he came over thinking he could bully us in the Oval Office and was given short shrift and sent home. We then tried to come back and resurrect this mineral deal that's had several iterations, and still now he's belligerent and refuses to sign it. Ironically, of course, what the United States is doing every time it's up for negotiation and Zelensky refuses, they just add a few more caveats just to, turn the screw on Ukraine in the process. So because he's cried wolf once too many times, then he's going to suffer the consequences. Well, of course, he's not going to want to sign the deal. Why would he? But the United States is now getting a salient lesson in, well, we can't trust him either. I mean, and so Zelensky, the argument could be, and we'll come on to this whole thing Putin said, which may end the war or is a way of ending the war, is Zelensky is becoming a huge obstacle in terms of the Russians and the United States. First off, saying, well, we could notionally reach an agreement on this, but as long as Ukraine implements it, such as don't bomb energy infrastructure, they continue to do that. Are they going to recognize a Black Sea deal? Probably not. So who cares really in the end of the day as things stand, whether the Russians and the Americans reach partial agreements on several things, it becomes irrelevant. Because if Ukraine doesn't implement it, then half of the parties fighting in this war will continue to do the things they're not supposed to do. And Ukraine will keep going, well, we didn't sign on that. You and the Russians agreed to that. We never agreed to it. Okay, the whole European angle on this is worth just briefly mentioning. It's pointless because they say a lot of things and now they don't want to go to war, and they never did. That was a lie. They don't want to send peacekeeping forces. They never did unless the United States did. The US isn't going to, so they're not going to. So all these stories about the Europeans wanting to go to war with Ukraine is a nonsense. It's absolutely not based in any truth. And just look at the polls. They came out after being very bombastic and talking about sending 300,000 troops to Ukraine, actually admitted it was all a lie. They had no intention of ever doing it. They just thought if they said it, it might scare Putin into giving up fighting the war, which of course was idiotic because Putin knew, as we knew, it was all hot air. Because if they did do that, then it's World War III. And the United States is never, ever going to have World War III with anyone unless they attack the US. And there's not a single country on this planet who would attack the United States for very obvious reasons, unless, of course, the United States attacked them first, including Russia and China, which is never going to happen either. Because the United States isn't stupid enough to do that. They may be stupid at times, but they're not that stupid because it's a war they would lose very badly in the process. So when you stack all these things up and then we come on to the issue of Putin. So I'll pause there and then we can obviously then go into what Putin said and what can we surmise from that, which I think isn't a stretch to say. In fact, I think it's quite plausible, our reasoning and thinking behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. And what we're going to get to here in a moment, it becomes more and more feasible with support of the United States, the more that Zelensky keeps, I don't want to say stabbing him in the back, but going against their own agreements and promises made. Now, two of the interesting things, we talked about Europe, and Europe is well known for bloviating when it comes to Ukraine. More and more, we're starting to see a division within the EU of wanting to continue this. Not just Hungary, but a few other nations are putting out vetoes, unanimous votes to send more money. But the one thing that's interesting is obviously as the U.S. and Europe become more divided, and what's going to happen when uh, an agreement, some type of agreement that the United States can stomach takes place, and U.S. then is willing to remove the sanctions against Russia, Russian companies, oil and gas, etc., and Europe is not. Or is Europe going to still continue to try to do that old saw of we're going to steal for all intents and purposes, but utilize the money that the frozen funds from Russia and do whatever they want with it. Do you really think they're going to use it to spend on Ukraine and rebuilding Ukraine? No. It's more along the lines that they want to protect their own financial system. That is another story altogether. But with that being said, because Zelensky, they're under martial law, they have thrown out the voting for elections. There is really no legitimacy for Zelensky or his government to sign any type of agreement, which leads into the potential that Putin posed this week. And I'll go ahead and pass it back to you, Paul.
Yeah, so just before we get specifically into that point, just a few other points. Zelensky's deeply unpopular domestically with people. He's lost the people a long time ago. The country is full of corruption. The country has got huge internal political problems. Its economy's non-existent. Its financial system is creating without lifelines, and Zelensky's already making comments. We need $200 billion a year to stay afloat, and someone's going to have to give it to us. Well, that's not going to happen. So, because of his unpopularity, and there is no doubt that this could be an opportunity, and it's not about having another Maidan. It's not about a coup or any of that nonsense, but maybe there's a route into actually being able to have an election inside Ukraine, which would then be a way, undoubtedly, of Zelensky losing. And the feeling is they'll get someone in, whoever that is, who's going to be far more capable of reaching a sensible negotiated settlement in the future. Now, you may argue, well, how the hell do you have an election when there's a war going on? Well, this was Putin's suggestion. He said to discuss the introduction note of an interim government in Ukraine, which basically would sidestep Zelensky. I'm sure there is enough people politically who would be in agreement with that. Okay, Zelensky may have other ideas, but that's irrelevant. This would be under the auspices, Putin says, of the UN and other nations. So he's going, everyone's included. An interim government is not going to be something we have anything to do with, or necessarily the Americans do. But what's the reason for an interim government? He said in order to organize elections there. Now, if there was an agreement to have elections and a ceasefire for 2 or 3 days to allow the election to happen and the results to come out, if you then get an interim to have proper elections and Zelensky's gone, then that might change the whole political structure of the war. It might mean agreements can be reached. It might mean that this impasse will end. And it's a way to end the war, because as things stand, if Zelensky's belligerence persists, then the war will never end until Ukraine completely capitulates and has to surrender unconditionally. And then there's no negotiation. Now, frankly, the US doesn't want that because it makes them look bad. The Europeans wouldn't want that because it makes them look bad because of all their support of Ukraine. And therefore, it's in everyone's interest to consider Putin's offer. I would think that offer may have been discussed already with the Americans, and the Americans have gone, I know, put it out there. Let's see if this is something we can achieve together. Because if Zelensky is the major obstruction, then logically find a way to put an interim government, have elections. Zelensky's no longer president legitimately because there should have been elections. Okay, you can argue when a war's going on. I would say, yeah, that's extremely difficult because areas of Ukraine wouldn't be able to vote in the middle of a war zone. It's just not reality. So, therefore, on that basis, that gives an opportunity to achieve those objectives. And that's why, in a way, it comes back to the original question: has Putin found a way, or along with the Americans, of going, this is a way to end the war legitimately, and for us then to be able to sensibly implement a peaceful resolution to the war? Because, as we said, as things stand, there's very little chance of that happening because Zelensky is going to obstruct everything because he wants what he wants, and that's never going to be achieved. I mean, he's been told NATO's not membership's not happening. Now the European Union's getting to the point of not wanting to consider Ukraine as a member till who knows when, probably after the European Union doesn't exist anymore, for argument's sake. So I think there's mileage in what Putin's saying, and in a way he's done it. So no one can point the finger and say, well, you're going to be involved in this process. You're going to put a puppet Russian president. No, it's a democratic election. The Ukrainians get who they want, and there's rumors already that there's several people in Ukraine who are influential enough to potentially form a government. Whether we agree with who that president is irrelevant. What's relevant is no one wants Zelensky anymore. They want to find a legitimate way to end his presidency, which effectively is over because his term of office expired last May.
Yeah, it's been nearly a year, and when you take a look at it, the Europeans want attrition. They want to try to bleed Russia, endless war. Russia wants to use attrition, and in many ways they're successful. There was a report out of some recruiter within Ukraine who was being had to go before a military board, and he laid it out. He said, "There's just nobody else to recruit. You can't hold me responsible for not getting more soldiers because there are none." And Ukraine as a whole, and the thing about it is Kyiv has pretty much, except for maybe power outages, been left unscathed. Almost the way like Berlin during World War I was left unscathed. And so the people who were in Berlin, if you ever read All Quiet on the Western Front, they thought everything was hunky-dory, and it was like a jolly good time. And you see in Kyiv, they're just not feeling the effects of the war. The longer this goes on, more people are going to have to be recruited from that area, and Russia may have no choice but to put the pressure onto the capital to try to drive people to the point that they're willing to, do something about their government to end the conflict. More and more pressure is coming along, and Russia at least is trying its best to offer solutions. The question is, will those who have the capacity to be able to do it, will they go ahead and accept that olive branch? Paul, any other comments on this you want to
No, I
bring
think
up today?
that's fine.
Very good. Paul, as always, thank you very much for your insight and for being a part of the discussion.
Yes, and likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you for your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.